Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hoyt Carriage Bridge discussion. My name is Neil Krupnick. I'm the Town of Hyde Park's Deputy Supervisor and Ward 1 Councilperson. And I am here today for two reasons. I'm here to help with technical aspects of conducting this presentation. So far off to a shaky start. And number two, because I think this is a really great and worthy project. Before I introduce our hosts, I want to let everyone know that there will be a Q&A session after this presentation. For those of you joining us via Zoom, please use the chat function, which you see at the bottom of your screen, and make sure you direct your questions toward John Lawson and not to me. For those of you watching on Facebook, you can ask a question in the comments. And before I introduce John Lawson, I'd like to introduce Supervisor Rohr, who has a few things to say.
Hi, everyone. Good to virtually see you. Wish it was in person, but we are getting there. And I won't take a lot of time, but I just really feel that it's important to extend our thanks and gratitude to Jeff and Zavino for really leading the charge here. And of course, to John Lawson, the chairman of CVPA, and to Peter Malewski, who are really leading the charge on getting this bridge reopened. And it was a bit of an outgrowth of Amtrak's decision to go ahead and start fencing off river access. And in Hyde Park, it seems that our access is really through these bridges, the abandoned bridges. And so Jeff and I had a number of conversations about the importance of these, and he just took and ran with it. And thank you. And I know that we have our former Ward 1 councilperson on the Zoom with us, Bob Linville, and I think this is a great example of what goes around comes around, because we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. Also thinking of another metaphor, it begins with a twinkle in your eye. And so, it has been a sentiment of all of us who love to walk and participate in all the great things Statsburg has to offer to see this bridge reopened. So thank you, gentlemen, for leading the charge here, and the town is happy to be a partner for you.
Thanks, Aileen. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to John Lawson, who is the chairman of the Calvert Vaux Preservation Alliance. So take it away, John.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Calvert Vaux Preservation Alliance, more comfortably known as CVPA, less of a mouthful, is a nonprofit organization. It's in government speak, we're a 501c3 organization. We're the official friends group for New York State for The Point in Statsburg. The Point, what is The Point? Well, many of you know it as the Hoyt House. It's the 19th century estate that was created by Calvert Vaux for Lydig Hoyt on the banks of the Hudson, abutting the Mills Mansion, now known as Statsburg State Historic Site. The original residence is still there. The brick outbuildings, which are of a later date, they were early 20th century, are also still there in all their glory. But the Point is not just buildings. The Point is as much about the landscape as it is the buildings. It's vistas, it was vistas of fields, it was woods, it was rock outcroppings, it was water features. And Vaux and Mr. Hoyt very carefully laid out scenic elements that were quite striking at the time and still are. Some of them we're trying to restore, such as Vaux's original views cut through the trees to the river and the Catskills. We've managed to restore the northward view, which many of you, I think, have seen. It's quite stunning, and we hope to continue restoring these views. There were 5 in total as time goes on. CVPA's website is calvertvaux.org. There is some information on that site, which probably many of you have accessed already. It is a website in progress, so it's not quite complete, but there is some information there that you may find useful, calvertvaux.org. So an important part of the landscape is the main drive that led to the main residence. This came, of course, from, it started at what was then called the Albany Post Road. It's now called the Old Post Road because the Albany Post Road was moved at some point to bypass the village of Staatsburg, the hamlet of Staatsburg. I'm sure many people in Staatsburg are delighted it was moved so that Route 9 doesn't plow through the center of their town. So it's now called the Old Post Road. We're calling it the Carriageway because it would have been built, of course, in the 1850s when there were carriages and not motor vehicles. I think, Neil, at this point, let me start with my slides. I have a few images I want to show everybody that will just give an idea of the feeling of the estate, the feeling of the site, and the reason that it was situated where it was. So you can go to the first slide, Neil. So here's a map. I hope it's not too hard to read. This is from Dole and Dole. This is a 1998 report called Landscape Management Plan for the Point. Incredibly thorough, voluminous report about the site. So way off to the right is that double line would be the Albany Post Road, now called the Old Post Road. And the bridge would be just to the left of that, going over the railroad tracks. And you can see the drive kind of had a serpentine layout. It passed marshes and water features, as I said. To the north or above the curving line would have been the Mills estate. And then way at the left side, you can see that dark shadow with the arrows coming out of it. That would have been what we call the Hoyt house, where the main drive ended in a circular drive. And I'm going to show you a couple images of that. The buildings up slightly to the right, above to the right, are what many of you have seen, I'm sure, the brick barns, which were added in the early 20th century. Let's go to the next slide, Neil. So here's the house in all its glory. There's the circular drive. It appears to have been maybe a gravel, a white or off-white gravel. This is the house at its finest, with the porches, the copper canopies, the slate roofs, the peaks. And what you can't see here, of course, is the views of the Hudson and the Catskills. Next slide, Neil. This would have been the other end of the carriageway. This is a modern photo, of course, taken by Jeff Anzavino. Looks pretty good, actually. This is right at the Old Post Road, as many of you know. And again, would have been the Albany Post Road. The columns are still there. The wall is still there, although slightly crumbling. We have discussed eventually trying to restore these with the help of local masons. More news on that will be forthcoming. Next, Neil. Here's another shot of the house at the other end of the carriageway. Here you can see the circular drive that comes around the trees and the lawn and would deposit visitors right in front of that portico, which, by the way, CVPA has stabilized the last year or so because it was crumbling. And we managed to stabilize it so that hopefully it'll be okay until we can get funds to restore it. What I love about this photo is you can see curtains upstairs. There are very few photos where you can see that. And it really shows that there were people living there. And of course, this is it also still has the porches on either side of the portico. They were taken down, I believe, in the 20s by, I think, the grandson of Lydig Hoyt. I think it was probably changing tastes and, you know, maybe they were rotting at that point, who knows? But it did quite substantially change the look of the house. Next, Neil. Here's a shot. It shows you also the front lawn with the shrubs. I'm very embarrassed to say I didn't do my homework and I don't know who the gentleman on the left is. He's obviously a Hoyt. The gentleman on the right, I believe, is Garrett Graham, who may have tuned in to this presentation tonight. Garrett still lives in Rhinebeck. I believe he told me once that was his uncle. And again, I'm embarrassed to say I can't name him. There probably are people watching who know exactly who that is. I don't know the dog's name either. Next. Here's a view, again, the end of the carriageway at the very bottom of the photo. This is looking directly east. These would have been some of the farm fields that surrounded the residence and were an integral part of the point, and the feeling that it had, the aesthetic, the ferme ornée, as the French would say, or ornamental farm. Next, Neil. And this is not really related to the carriageway, but I just love this photo. It's the boathouse that I believe was shared with the Mills family next door. And it does, of course, show that in our efforts to reopen the bridge, we will be easing the connection between the land and the Hudson, between the interior of the land and the Hudson River, where the boathouse once stood. If you look closely, you can see the quatrefoil inlays on the side of the boathouse, which I really love. I have them on my garden too. Next picture, Neil. This is was the superintendent's house, which you could see from the carriageway as you rode in. Very simple building, designed, we believe, by Vaux originally for the estate. To me, slightly uncharacteristic of Vaux, very little ornamentation, very utilitarian looking. It was torn down, I believe, in the early 60s when New York State took over the point. Very simple, but very picturesque as well. Next, Neil. And here, of course, is the 5-bay garage, which is still standing. This would have been a fairly early shot. We believe these were built in the very early 20th century, possibly the first decade. Look at the old vehicles. That probably dates the photo to some extent. And again, look on the second floor. You see the curtains, which would indicate that people, probably chauffeurs or workers of some kind, lived up there in apartments. Next, Neil. And here, right next door, is the carriage house. Wonderful photo. There was a gravel drive leading to it just off of the main carriageway. These look like stable boys holding the horses, and to the left is an actual carriage, which would buttress our use of the word carriageway. Of course, being that these brick barns were built in the early 20th century, the carriage was probably somewhat of a leftover, but they obviously still used it. Next. And here, it's still there also, is the cow barn. This was before the woods took over. Again, all the open fields, open vistas. The center doors were pocket doors. They're still there. They do not pocket anymore. They're kind of frozen shut. But the building is still there. It needs a lot of help, but we hope to restore it as time goes on for varied uses. What's interesting to me about this photo is that those center doors are off center. They're not center. I've been in that building. It's partly because to the right, there was a dropped down area, I believe, for dropping hay or perhaps animal stalls. It was a cow barn. Perhaps someone listening can fill us in on that, but it's interesting because it kind of throws off the whole symmetry of the building. Next, Neil. And here is another vista you would have gotten from the carriageway. This was the old plant house, plant shed, very picturesque, quite small building. The ruins are still there, but it does show you how everything was cleared. The woods, of course, that are there today were not there then. I cannot date this photo, but it does kind of indicate the aesthetics of what you saw as you were approaching the Hoyt residence on the carriageway. And next slide. And finally, here's a modern shot. This is a swimming pool. I included it because although it's modern, it shows again the open characteristics of the site. All of the woods just did not exist then. They were all cleared, not only for scenic vistas, but for farming, crops, probably to a certain extent, some pasture land for horses. In the background is our off-kilter cow barn again. This swimming pool was built, I believe, in 1959. It is still there. If you walk into the woods near the cow barn, you can see it. There are trees growing up out of it, but it's still there. It's quite a distance from the house, so when they wanted to go swimming, they had to take a bit of a walk. I think that's it for my images. Neil, is that right? Yes. Okay. So let's get to the reason for tonight. An important part of this main Carriageway Drive, of course, is the bridge over the railroad tracks. The bridge that's there now was built, Jeff may correct me, I believe around 1911, the steel bridge. Obviously, it's not the original bridge to the point. I have never been able to find any images of that original bridge. If anyone out there can guide me in that, I'd be forever grateful. I've also never been able to find any images of the gatehouse. We believe there was one, and in fact, if you walk toward that steel bridge today from the old post road, there is an old ruined foundation on the left, just before the bridge, which looks like it very well could have been a gatehouse. But again, we've never been able to find any images. It's very hard to find images of the early, of the point in its early years. Not only, I suppose, because photography was just being born then, but also we have not been able to find, drawings, paintings, any kind of plans. So again, any help we can get from the audience would be greatly appreciated. So let's get to the bridge, the steel bridge over the tracks. The hikers used it for years, as many of you know and will agree. It was closed, I think, I'm guessing, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, perhaps, because of the decay of the metal decking on the top. We are proposing to reopen it for hikers and walkers, not vehicles. I suppose bicycles would be allowed, but I'm not sure who would want a bicycle through the trail system. It's kind of hilly and difficult, but you never know. Perhaps there's some intrepid sorts out there. We have very strong support to get this bridge reopened. We have letters of support from Mills Norrie State Park. Thank you, Christina Schopfer, for that. Christina's the park manager. We have letters from the town of Hyde Park. Thank you, Aileen Rohr, for that. Hudson River Heritage sent us a letter of support. Thank you, Warren Temple Smith. And remarkably, we got a wonderful letter of support from Amtrak, which we thought could be a hurdle, but they've been quite cooperative and supportive in this effort. So how are we going to get the bridge open? I don't want to say too much to take away from Jeff and Peter's presentations, but it'll be 2 phases, briefly. Phase 1 will be what we call a historic structure report, or an HSR. This will be a study done by Peter Maluski, who's going to be speaking shortly, to assess the existing conditions of the bridge and work up a plan for a budget and a restoration plan for the bridge. We believe, and again, I'll let Peter talk more on this, that it's primarily the wood decking on top that needs to be replaced, but the historic structure report will assess the steel, the condition of the steel, and tell us whether that is true. How are we going to pay for this? Well, we have applied for a Hudson River Valley Greenway grant, which we have good confidence about getting. What is the Hudson River Valley Greenway? It's a state agency, and I'm going to read you one sentence. It's a state agency created to preserve the scenic, natural, historic, cultural, and recreational resources of the Hudson Valley. So it seems to be right up our alley. We have submitted the application. We will hear from them on June 10th, whether we've received it. And if we have received it, we will be announcing a fundraising campaign to raise matching funds, because as most of you know, Many grants, if not most, require matching funds. This one is fairly generous in its allowance of in-kind contributions, meaning non-cash contributions. But that's something we will let all of you know about after June 10th. So phase 2, after the study, would be the actual repair. The timeline we're looking at, we're trying to get the study done by Mr. Maluski by the fall. Originally, we had been a little bit overzealous in saying we could get this whole thing done this summer. That seems probably a little unrealistic at this point. So we're looking at getting the study done by the fall and hopefully the repair work done by next spring. I think Peter had suggested we could try for 2022 Memorial Day, which I think is a great target. But this would mean we could open up the bridge again. You could walk over it just like we used to get into Mills Norrie Park and to the point. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Anzavino and Peter Maluski. If I could just introduce them to you briefly. Jeff is going to speak first. Jeff Anzavino, AICP, is the Director of Land Use Advocacy at Scenic Hudson, where he works with communities to ensure that riverfront development is resilient, stimulates the economy, connects people with the river, and conserves views and natural resources. Jeff is responsible for Scenic Hudson's River Access Initiative and manages the Hudson River Access Plan and Historic Truss Bridge Cultural Resource Survey, and he co-authored Revitalizing Hudson Riverfronts, which won a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 2 Environmental Quality Award in 2013. Fantastic. He earned accreditation from the American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP, in 2003. Jeff is also an adjunct instructor at Marist College's Department of Environmental Science and Policy, where he has taught a senior level course in environmental planning since 2011. Finally, he graduated cum laude from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County with a BA in geography. So that is Jeff's introduction. Let me also read, since Peter's going to be speaking after Jeff, let me read a brief bio of Peter. Peter is the owner of Peter Maluski LLC. The LLC provides visionary transportation and planning advisory services to the public, private, and not-for-profits along the East Coast of the United States. Peter has 38 years of professional civil engineering and bridge experience, 24 years in the public sector at the New York State Thruway Authority, and 14 years in the private sector. In regards to the Hoyt Bridge, his recent relevant experience includes co-author of the 2020 Hudson River Access Plan, co-author of the 2021 Historic Steel Truss Bridges Cultural Resource Survey, which is an incredible document. Peter also has a BS in civil engineering from Syracuse and an MS in urban and environmental studies from RPI. Peter also played an active role, by the way, in the restoration of the Coal Dock Bridge in Hyde Park that took place, I guess it was a couple years ago, but there we are. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you. Jeff's going to tell us a little more about the steel bridges and maybe the Hoyt Bridge in particular. So Jeff, off we go.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Neil and Peter and everyone else for joining us this evening. I just love this. I love this bridge as I do all the bridges, and I want to work hard to open them for you and for others. This cultural resource survey that John mentioned was funded by a Preserve New York grant, and Preserve New York is the signature grant program of the New York State Council on the Arts and the Preservation League of New York State. The Cultural Resource Survey was one of the recommendations of the Hudson River Access Plan that Scenic Hudson did with Peter Maluski back in 2020. And the Hudson River Access Plan was an initiative to document the places where people are using the river's shore, how many people are using it, what they're using the river for, boating, fishing, ice boating, nature study, etc. And the Hudson River Access Plan found that there are several historic truss bridges that span the railroad. Many of these are in parks, and are in a state of disrepair and closed, just like the one at the Hoyt Carriageway. But if they'd be restored, they could provide additional river access. So that's why Scenic Hudson is interested in getting these bridges reopened. There are 12 historic truss bridges, all built around 1911 and 1912, except one that was built in 1928 at the former Dominican camp. And these 12 bridges were studied in the Cultural Resource Survey. And when we did the Hudson River Access Plan, we learned that of the 12, 9 were listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or eligible, by virtue of their location in the Hudson River National Historic Landmark District, but 3 of them, the southernmost 3 at the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site, Coal Dock Lane, and the former Dominican camp, were not eligible for listing, and therefore they were unprotected. So as a result of the Historic Truss Bridge Cultural Resource Survey, I'm happy to report that those 3 bridges were deemed by the New York State Historic Preservation Office now as eligible for listing, and they'll be protected from any kind of federal action that may try to harm them or take them down. And by the way, Hyde Park, you should be proud. I like to tell, I love to tell people that we live in a very competitive world, and you've got to show the world what you have and no one else has. Now, a lot of communities have the Hudson River, like as does Hyde Park. Hyde Park has the Vanderbilt Mansion and FDR. Hyde Park also has many of these historic truss bridges. In fact, 8 of the 12 are in Hyde Park. And of those 8, 5 of them are in public parks. And several of them provide access to the Hyde Park Trail, which is a Hudson River Valley Greenway trail. So that's why it's particularly important to get this Greenway grant to restore the bridge and the carriageway to provide access between the hamlet of Statsburg and the Hyde Park Trail and other places in the park. The bridges in Hyde Park are the FDR Crum Elbow Bridge, Coal Dock Lane, former Dominican camp, the Hoyt Carriageway, Penny Lane, Strawberry Lane, and then 2 in the Hopeland district of Mills Norrie State Park. We call them Hopeland South and Hopeland North. So Hyde Park, yeah, you should be proud to have so many of these wonderful bridges in your town. We can go to the next slide, please. So the bridge that we're talking about is a Warren Truss Bridge. The abutment says 1911. We've seen documentation 1912. It was probably built in those 2 years. And I believe it holds the most promise of all the bridges in our cultural resource survey for the benefit that it can provide the public if restored and reopened. The bridge was built about 60 years after Lydig Hoyt originally purchased the 62 acres. That was the beginning of his purchase there. That would eventually become the point. He bought that land in 1852, just 2 years after the Hudson River Railroad began operating. And now that carriageway is part of Mills Norrie State Park, and it leads to Hoyt House and the Point, which is a National Historic Landmark in the Statsburg State Historic Site. Calvert Vaux aligned the carriageway by extending a pre-existing farm road. And this was during the years just preceding his design with Frederick Law Olmsted of Central Park. So the carriageway is really an important site in the continuum of American landscape architecture. Vaux extended the existing farm road that entered the property across the rail line and along a winding route and an upland marsh, hugging the base of a forested ridge and eventually rising to the top of a small ridge where Vaux sited a brick stable that John showed pictures of. At this point, the road forked to the north to a farm cottage and vegetable garden, and to the south through a shallow ravine, and then ascending finally to the Hoyt House site. The winding drive leading from Old Post Road was aligned to preserve trees and the high aesthetic value that both Mr. Hoyt and Calvert Vaux found at this site. I love the way Francis Arkowski describes the carriageway. He wrote a book called Country Park and City, The Architecture and Life of Calvert Vaux. and he describes the route of the carriageway just in the most loving manner. And I know many of you have walked the site, so I'll read this, and maybe you can envision your experiences on the carriageway. According to Kowski, following this 3/4 mile approach road today, one can still appreciate the care with which Vaux adopted its twistings and turnings to the singularity of the ground. Along this shady lane, we can almost hear Vaux reciting the words that he wrote on planning rural drives. Quote, "A single existing tree," he said, "ought often to be all sufficient reason of slightly diverting the line of the road so as to take advantage of its shade instead of cutting it down and grubbing up its roots." The accumulated influences of study, travel, sketching, and life with Downing that had formed Vaux's attitude towards landscape design had reached maturity by the time he had laid out the drives and otherwise arranged the Hoyt property. And although the landscape stands in need of restoration, it is still poignantly evocative of its past beauty. Now, the 2013 master plan for Mills Norrie State Park addresses the condition of the Truss Bridge and recommends its restoration. The plan says the Hoyt Bridge is in very poor condition and in need of rehabilitation. This bridge is critical to the integrity of the point. The existing of a prior bridge may predate the estate development and effectively fix the location of the estate entrance, the old post road frontage. Low walls, pillars, entrance lane, and bridge over the railroad are all one piece and all capable of being restored. The treatment of the entrance, the bridge, deck, and nearly all the estate's carriage road system can and should be as close to original as possible, including grade, alignment, and width. These resources will be restored as funding allows. So given Calvert Vaux's role in the alignment of this carriageway and the historic importance of the bridge, it will be hugely important to recreate for the public the anticipation of arriving at the Hoyt House as it was intended by Calvert Vaux and by Lydig Hoyt. And I just love the fact that restoring the stone walls, the bridge, and carriageway provides Staatsburg residents this experience, as well as a direct pedestrian connection into Mills Norrie State Park and the Staatsburg State Historic Site, and finally on down to the Hudson River. So thank you all for being here, and I'll be available for questions later. But now I just want to turn it over to Peter Maluski.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. And it's been a pleasure working with Jeff and John the last few months on the grant application with Greenway, and also with a number of you that are on the call. I noticed people from state parks and the town and so forth. And, shared Jeff's passion for these bridges. And I got to know this bridge with the last study, and really looking forward to bringing this home for everybody in the months ahead. So, as you know from the fence line, this is the top of the bridge, and it's a Warren truss and with verticals, which means a Warren truss is a W-shaped structure, and the verticals means what it says. It has vertical components between the W's, so that's why it says with verticals. It's about 136 feet long. It's 17.5 feet wide. The steel truss, which we found is typical for a lot of these 12 bridges, is in very good shape above the deck line. That's because the steel, when it gets wet, it immediately gets dry. The water is not sitting on it, and the steel has, especially that type of steel that's over 100 years old, gets a nice rust patina on it, and that rust patina protects it from getting additional rust. So from the top, it's in pretty good shape. We're not too concerned about that. The wooden deck, the wooden planking, it's 3-inch pine was the original planking, is in very poor condition, and that's why the bridge is closed. You can see there's original planking, there was additional planking that was put on top of that. There's some planking from where the where the wheel lines would be as well. So we're already dismissing the wood. The wood planking definitely needs to go on the bridge. The bridge was designed originally for 10.5 tons. And if you look into the Cultural Resource Survey report for the 12 bridges, there's this cute photo of a steamroller from 1912, which is what they used as the design load. They designed the bridge to be able to handle that 10-ton roller. And I'll get to it later, but we don't need, as John mentioned, we don't need the bridge to handle 10 tons. It's not going to be a roadway bridge. We want it to be pedestrian, bicycle, and we'll see how the study goes. You know, if Parks is able to bring an occasional maintenance vehicle, you know, a light pickup across, that'd be great as well. Neil, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is standing looking at the south side of the bridge. You see this 70-foot steel truss in the center. And then on each approach, there's a 31-foot long concrete approaches, which back in 1911, 1912, these concrete approaches were pretty state of the art. It was a new material for them to be for spanning that kind of distance with concrete for bridge decks. And you also see there's 2 concrete piers. There's between the pier columns, there is an old railroad crash wall that's designed that if you do get a derailment, the train does not hit the column. It just kind of glances off. And there's 2 concrete abutments as well. Okay, Neil. This is the east abutment of the bridge. A few things to discuss here. If you look at the top of the photo, you'll see the 4 concrete box beams. So they're solid concrete with rebar inside them. And this span was also designed for 10 tons. Back then, they didn't put a lot of reinforcing steel into the structures. And on the deck itself, underneath, it is a poured concrete deck. You'll see a lot of black lines. That's actually the reinforcing steel. And it's areas where there wasn't enough concrete cover when they poured the deck. And then over time, the thin amount of concrete cover that was on the rebar popped off. So if you were opening this up for vehicle traffic for 10 tons or something, that was something you probably want to repair. For opening it for the purpose we want to open it for, you know, we'll make a final decision in the report, but probably don't have to do a lot of work to get that reopened. But that's something we will take a look at. The concrete abutment, in addition to some artwork, has you can see the footing of the concrete abutment is eroding underneath. There's a drainage issue up above that's washing the concrete out. Since there's no load on the bridge right now, that's not a big concern. That void would have to be filled with some flowable concrete or so forth before it could reopen, just so that concrete, that's more of a mass pour. There's not a lot of reinforcement in there, so that if there gets more erosion, the footing could just crack in the middle. So I want to get that done before that happens. And obviously the tree should probably be removed as well. Okay, Neil, you go to the next slide. This is a good photo. This tells you a lot. Again, we're looking east. I'll start with the steel. You see the steel truss at the top, and underneath, going in the direction of the bridge and lengthwise of the bridge, you'll see a number of stringers. Those are wood. Those are wood stringers. They're original. And what we found out, and I'll talk about in a minute on the Coal Dock Lane project, they are in very good shape. And on the other bridges, when we looked, Jeff and I looked at the 12 bridges, the bridges we could, you know, stay within confines of Amtrak and not getting on the tracks, reach out and look at some of these wooden stringers. They're in very good shape. They're like if they were in your attic for 100 years. They're nice and dry. They're in good shape. And between holding the stringers up at each panel point, you'll see, oh, thank you. Yeah. you see at the arrow, there's steel cross members, and there's steel floor beams that go across from left to right in your screen that support all the stringers. So each one of those steel floor beams, there you go, is at each panel point. So that's the big question mark, is that the wood stringers, the steel floor beams support the ends of the wood stringers. And how they support the wood stringers is that there's L-shaped steel angles that are bolted onto the, or riveted onto the steel floor beams, and they act as a seat, and the stringers sit on that seat. And what happens is that when you have the steel, you have the wood deck on top, you have the wood beams and so forth, the moisture gets in there, and there is going to be steel deterioration. So we have to decide how much it is. If it's not a lot of steel deterioration, it's not a big concern. We can just replace the deck and move on, because again, we're not reopening this to 10-ton loads. So if it has a minor amount of deterioration, we can let it go. If it has a couple of areas that are bad, but the rest of it's in good condition, we'll have to fix those few areas. The other thing you want to point out is on the top of the two, you'll see the concrete pier, and on the top of the two concrete columns, there's a steel stub column. So in 1988, CSX went through and raised the number of bridges on the line because they wanted to bring in double stack trains. So I believe each bridge is a little different in height. I believe these are approximately 1 foot, maybe 1 foot 1 inch in height. So what they did was they came in, they jacked up the steel truss, and put these stub columns up, they raised the bridge, and then on top of the pier cap, between the two columns, you'll see wood timbers, and the wood timbers is actually supporting the end of the truss. And what they also did on the approach, since they raised the truss a foot, is they added another foot of fill on the concrete approach spans. So that's something to consider. It's more dead weight on the concrete approach spans. But again, for the intended use, it should not be a big problem. And we have on the bottom of the pier caps, we have some diagonal cracks that you can see on the columns. Those are shear cracks that's usually from a severe point load and so forth. So they would have to be repaired, or under the project, we'll go out and put a hammer on them and just make sure if they're solid, that's okay. They can be repaired. If not, we might put a stub column in the middle of the cap beam just to support it. But it should be able to be repaired and not replaced. And I think that's it for that slide. We can go on to the next one. Okay, so John mentioned the Coal Dock Lane Bridge also in Hyde Park, and that early in with the pandemic, it's hard to remember dates nowadays. So that's 2021. So in 2020, about a year ago, the county asked DOT to come out and do a cursory review because there was some problems with the railroad had noticed some issues with some of the steel over the tracks. So DOT came out and they red flagged a couple of the floor beams. This is the steel floor beams that I was talking about in the other photos. And red flag means you can't use the bridge until they're repaired. So Coal Dock Lane serves the Rogers Marina, 3 homes, and a water intake, and some other auxiliary items. So the closure was kind of devastating last year. So working with the town and Jeff and many of you on this call, we came up with a plan to repair the bridge. And so we had the deck on the bridge, the wood deck was in good shape because the marina had just replaced it a few years earlier. So the contractor, Harrison Burroughs, took the deck back off, which enabled us to look at the steel. And we found that three of the floor beams were in very poor condition. As you can see from this floor beam here, it's hard to see, but you'll see on the bottom of the floor beam, you'll see shadows and they look like little I-beams. Those are the seats that I was talking about. That's where the wood stringers sit. So some of them were very deteriorated and needed to be replaced. But the other part was, you see in the middle of the floor beam, you can see the sky behind the floor beam, and that's not planned to be that way. So that's all steel that was just totally deteriorated. And that this floor beam in particular was starting to sag. So caught it just in time. So now it's, it was re-rated. It's now reopened at 10 tons. And that was done, design in early fall, and the plans, and then working with Amtrak and a number of stakeholders. We had it open just before the first snow at the end of 2020. The good news for Hoyt Bridge is that we learned a lot and what to expect on the Hoyt Bridge project from this project. We don't expect the floor beams to be in that poor condition, but we don't know until we open the deck up. I think it's a different bridge, a different set of circumstances. I'm thinking it's going to be in better shape, but we don't know until we open it up. Okay, that's it on that one, Neil. So that's a quick recap of where we are. And as John mentioned, we'll do the study and the report this summer. Our goal is to have it open by Memorial Day 2022. Hopefully there's not a lot of repairs that are needed, and most of the work will be just putting a new deck on it. In addition to a new wood deck, we will need obviously to put fencing, some kind of aesthetically pleasing but functional fence on the structure and on the approaches as you get off. I know New York State Parks mentioned about, we want to make sure vehicles don't go over it. So we'll have some vehicle bollards near the bridge as well. So, people can walk or bike through, but they can't take a vehicle across. So fingers crossed for June 10th. That's the date that Greenway has in their application for making an announcement. But we've been discussing a lot, Jeff, John, and I, and with or without the grant, we have ideas to move forward. And one of the things we'll do, and depending on whether we get the grant or not, is the bridge inspection. Do we go from the top, remove boards over each of those panel points and inspect the steel and put the boards back? Or do we use a bucket truck from underneath, accessing along CSX and using a lift truck? And obviously the railroad will have a flag person there and inspect the steel from underneath. So there's pluses and minuses to each option. They both work. So we haven't made a final decision on that yet. And as John mentioned, we'll phase 2, the cost of the actual bridge construction, bridge repair, that obviously is dependent on what we find when we get out there later this summer. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to John.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Can you hear me, everybody? Peter, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so as I said earlier, we'll wait till June 10th to see if we get the Greenway grant. And if so, then we'll be informing everybody about the formal fundraising effort to raise the matching funds. And we'll be working out the in-kind contributions for same. So we'll keep you apprised of what's going on the Calvert Box website, calvertbox.org. And I believe, Neil, we had talked about also doing something on the Hyde Park Facebook page. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. So in those two venues, we'll keep everybody aware of how things are going. And we're happy to accept any questions if anyone has any. I'm going to look at them now. Okay, here's a question. This is from Kitty McCullough, who, full disclosure, is a CVPA board member. She actually says not to discuss tonight, but it doesn't make sense not to acknowledge that the bridge must ultimately be open to vehicles to give visitors the picturesque experience that Vaux designed. It would be necessary for the carriageway to be the visitor entrance. Well, it's a very good point. Right now, the way vehicles get to the Hoyt House site and the point is from the Norrie Point entrance to the south, or the entrance past the old superintendent's house at Mills Mansion, which is much more hilly and rocky. The Norrie Point entrance is quite smooth and level. But Kitty makes a very good aesthetic point that should we want to try to restore the site to the aesthetic that was intended by Vaux and Mr. Hoyt, that original drive would be open to vehicles. Although originally, of course, it would have been carriages back in 1855 when the site was designed. Okay, I'm looking at other questions. Shaw asks, how much needs to be raised by the public? Well, again, Shaw, this will be determined by the June 10th announcement by Greenway, whether we got the grant or not. If we get the grant, we believe we're going to need to raise in cash about $10,000 for matching funds. That's just a general figure right now. We think we'll need to raise 15, but about 5 of that we are hoping could be in kind, although that may have changed recently. We had worked out some cooperation with New York State Bridge Authority, but their schedule for the summer is kicking into high gear, so that may not work out. Okay. Shaw would also like to know where the bridge leads to. Not quite sure what you mean by that, Shaw. It starts, of course, at the pillars on the Old Post Road that lead into Staatsburg Hamlet. And as I showed on the map early on, it winds its way around, eventually joins the Blue Trail in the Mills Norrie State Park. You can look at the Mills Norrie Trail map to see where the Blue Trail goes. That Blue Trail leads past what was actually another estate just to the south of the Mills, of the Hoyt residence, called Stonehurst, or the Lee Mansion. You can just barely see the ruins of that now. That was also a Hoyt family connection. But basically the bridge leads over the railroad tracks to the Vaux and Leidig Hoyt designed serpentine historic drive to the point. Here's one from Matt, who says, oh yeah, Matt works with Dee Dee Barrett. Thank you, Matt. Peter, you might take this one. Are there any Department of Transportation issues aside from the bridge structure?
No. In fact, as part of DOT's, DOT was kind of with Parks request to do an unofficial cursory review of the structure a few years ago. Not an official inspection report, but that they noted the same things that I noted, was the cracks on the pier and some of the other, and obviously the bad deck and some other deficiencies. But then again, they weren't able to, again, because of Amtrak clearance and so forth, they weren't able to look at the steel under the deck. But DOT was a big help with the reopening of Cold Dock Lane. I don't see any issues. There's not any flags that we have to address. I don't see, once we have it repaired and open, we will file something with DOT just so they have it for their records. Have it through Parks. We'll give it to Parks to send to DOT.
Okay, great. Let's see. Amy asks, wait, Only $10,000 to $15,000 is needed to be raised for both phase 1 and phase 2 if the grant is accepted? No, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, Amy. The $10,000 I mentioned, 10 to 15, is for phase 1 only. That would fund the study to be done by Peter Maluski LLC. Phase 2 is the actual construction, and the budget is not worked out yet for that until phase 1 is complete. I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Peter D says, are the documents you mentioned available at the Statsburg Library? I'm not sure what documents you're referring to, Peter. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question.
If he means, I'll just pipe in here, if he means the cultural resource survey, Neil put that up, the link up. It's at hudsonriveraccess.org, and then scroll down, you'll get that whole report.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions. We're delighted everybody joined us tonight, and stay tuned. We're pretty confident that we're going to get this done. It's a wonderful collaboration between Peter and Jeff and CVPA. And we'll keep our fingers crossed till June 10th and see if Greenway believes in us. We're fairly confident they will. Then we'll move on from there, and hopefully by next Memorial Day, we'll all be walking across that bridge again. So any other comments, Jeff or Peter?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Just to say thanks to Neil, John, and Peter for being on tonight, and everyone for being here, and we look forward to working with everyone.
Terrific. Okay. Thank you, Neil, for helping us with the technical aspects.
You're extremely welcome.
Okay. Signing off.